Reid's mornings began in a quiet hum of dissatisfaction. His apartment, a sterile box on the city's edge, offered a view of the sprawling industrial district, dominated by the skeletal remains of the derelict factory. Its rusted girders clawed at the gray sky, a constant reminder of things left unfinished, abandoned. He worked in an office tower miles away, pushing papers, his days a monotonous cycle of reports and deadlines. The sameness was a comfort, a predictable rhythm that kept the more unsettling corners of his mind at bay, but lately, a subtle tremor had begun to run beneath the surface of his routine. A feeling, formless and fleeting, that the edges of his ordered world were fraying. He'd just settled into his second cup of lukewarm coffee, the city beginning its low roar outside his window, when his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something, a flicker of intuition he rarely indulged, prompted him to answer. "Mr. Reid?" A clipped, formal voice, devoid of inflection, came through the receiver. "This is the solicitor's office of Blackwood & Sons. We are contacting you regarding the estate of Miss Elara Vance." Reid frowned, a ripple of confusion spreading through him. Elara Vance. The name was a ghost from a half-forgotten past, a distant relative, a great-aunt perhaps, whom he'd met only once, maybe twice, as a small child. He remembered a woman with sharp eyes and a scent of wood smoke and something else, something herbal and faintly acrid. He hadn't thought of her in decades. "Miss Vance passed away last week," the solicitor continued, oblivious to Reid's sudden internal scramble. "Him will specifies you as the sole inheritor of him property. A cabin. Deep within the Blackwood Forest. A cabin." The word hung in the air, incongruous with the drone of city traffic and the concrete expanse outside his window. Blackwood Forest. He knew the name, a sprawling, untamed wilderness on the far side of the state, rumored to hold forgotten logging trails and more than a few local legends about disappearances. It was the kind of place people spoke of in hushed tones, a wild, ancient stretch of land that felt disconnected from the modern world. A cabin? Reid managed, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. "Why me? I barely knew her. Miss Vance had no direct descendants, Mr. Reid. Her will was quite clear. We require your presence to sign the necessary documents. Our office is open until 5. The line clicked dead before Reid could formulate another question. He stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, the hum of the city now a distant thrum beneath the sudden, unsettling quiet of his thoughts. A cabin in Blackwood Forest. The words played over and over, stirring a dust of unease that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with the unknown. He looked out again at the derelict factory, its silent, decaying mass of familiar comfort that now felt hollow. The world outside his window, once predictable, had suddenly shifted on its axis. He felt a peculiar pull, a strange compulsion to understand this unexpected turn. He had to go. The drive was long, a slow erosion of familiar landscapes. The urban sprawl gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to sleepy towns, until finally, the asphalt narrowed into a 2-lane road flanked by an encroaching wall of trees. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The sky, which had been a clear, unapologetic blue when he left, began to bruise with an evening purple as he delved deeper into the forest. His phone signal died somewhere an hour back, leaving him with only the static of the radio, which he eventually switched off. The silence that filled the car was profound, broken only by the crunch of tires on gravel and the distant calls of unseen birds. The trees here were old, ancient sentinels with gnarled limbs that interlocked overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even in the late afternoon. Reid found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter, a prickle of unease forming at the base of his neck. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a heightened awareness, a sense of being watched by something vast and indifferent. He followed the sparse, almost illegible directions from the solicitor's office, turning onto a narrow, overgrown track that felt less like a road and more like a scar in the landscape. Branches scraped against the car's paint, protesting his intrusion. The light thinned further, reduced to pale shafts that struggled to pierce the dense canopy. He felt the isolation acutely now, a physical pressure in his chest. Finally, the track opened into a small, weed-choked clearing. In its center stood the cabin. It was smaller than he'd imagined, hunkered low to the ground, almost swallowed by the surrounding forest. A porch sagged precariously, and a thin, almost invisible tendril of ivy had begun its slow, persistent crawl across the stone chimney. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something else, something earthy and metallic, like old pennies left in wet soil. Reid killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled even the sounds of his own breathing. He sat for a long moment, staring at the cabin. It didn't look inviting. It looked patient, as if it had been waiting. This wasn't just a building. It felt like a presence. This cabin, this forgotten place, was a door, and he had just stepped through. Damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. The track ended abruptly at a clearing. And there it was. Not a cabin in the rustic sense, but a squat, formidable structure, built of rough-hewn stone and dark, weathered timber. It seemed to crouch low to the ground, almost partially sunken, its few windows small, dark slits like eyes peering out from under heavy brows. A single, massive iron door, pocked with rust and age, was set into the front. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb. A shiver traced Reid's spine. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the faint, rhythmic drip. Drip. Drip from somewhere deep within the structure. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated in the ground beneath his feet, a low thrum that settled in his bones. He approached the door, his hand trembling as he inserted the key. It turned with a groan that echoed like a dying man's last breath. The interior was a single, large room, choked with dust and the scent of mildew, stale air, and that same metallic tang. Sparse, heavy furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot, stood like silent sentinels. A stone fireplace dominated one. Reid stood, the deadline a cold weight against his ear. The city's hum, usually a comforting blanket of white noise, now felt like a distant, irrelevant drone. Miss Vance, dead. A cabin. An inheritance. It was too much, too fast, too wrong. He tried to dismiss the gnawing unease that had settled in his gut since the initial call. He'd always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to dissect problems, to find logical explanations. But the past few days, even before the lawyer's call, had begun to chip away at that foundation. It had started subtly, a faint, metallic tang in the air of his apartment, like old pennies left out in the rain, despite the windows being sealed. He'd blamed the building's ancient pipes, or perhaps a neighbor's forgotten cooking. Then came the shadows. Deeper. He'd catch them in his peripheral vision, elongated, shifting forms that seemed to writhe at the edges of his sight, only to snap back into inert furniture when he turned his head directly. He'd rub his eyes, convinced it was fatigue, the strain of long hours at his desk. But then, the sounds. A low, rhythmic thump. Thump. Thump that vibrated through the floorboards late at night. It wasn't the bass of a neighbor's music, it was too deep, too resonant, like something heavy being dragged across rough earth, miles away, yet somehow inside his building. Last night, it had been undeniable. He'd sat bolt upright, part hammering, convinced someone was in the apartment. He'd tried to tell himself it was a dream, a vivid nightmare, but the smell had clung to his pajamas until morning. The lawyer's call had shattered any remaining pretense of normalcy. Vance. The cabin. The forest. The pieces, disparate and unsettling, were beginning to coalesce into a terrifying mosaic. He couldn't rationalize it anymore. The phenomena were escalating, becoming more frequent, more insistent. They were no longer confined to the edges of his perception, they were invading his space, his senses, his sanity. He needed answers. He couldn't just walk into this inheritance blind. He started with Miss Vance's name, cross-referencing it with the cabin's rumored location, a forgotten patch of forest known only to a handful of locals. His initial searches yielded little beyond sparse property records and a few forum posts from decades ago, discussing local eccentricities and urban legends. The Vance place, one post read, always had a strange vibe. Old Man Vance was a recluse. Heard stories about things buried out there. Another, even older, hinted at unnatural claims on the land. He broadened his search, looking for any historical records pertaining to the area, to the Vance family, to ancient burial grounds. He sifted through digitized local newspaper archives, obscure historical society newsletters, and even digitized copies of old property deeds. Hours bled into one another, the screen's blue light painting his face in the growing twilight. Then, a hit. An article from 1903, detailing the founding of a local industrial venture, Vance & Sons Ironworks. The article mentioned the family's deep roots in the region, their acquisition of vast tracts of land. Their initial factory location, a site now known only as the derelict factory, a skeletal ruin on the outskirts of the nearest town. Hallowed. Ancient significance. The derelict factory. There was a connection, a thread leading from the cabin, through Miss Vance, back to this industrial husk. He grabbed his keys, the decision sudden and urgent. He needed to see it, to feel whatever lingering echoes might reside there. The drive was short, the paved road quickly giving way to a cracked, overgrown lane. The derelict factory loomed against the bruised twilight sky, a jagged silhouette of rusted corrugated metal and shattered windows. The air here was heavy, stagnant, tasting of decay and damp earth, a stronger, more defined version of the scent that had invaded his apartment. He pushed open a protesting gate, the shriek of rusted hinges echoing across the desolate expanse. Inside, the main building was a vast, cavernous space, choked with dust and the skeletal remains of machinery. Rust-colored stains bled down the walls, mimicking grotesque bloodstains. Every step he took on the concrete floor sent up clouds of fine particulate, thick with the smell of forgotten industry and something else, something organic, something that had rotted and returned to the earth. He moved slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating crumbling brickwork and collapsed sections of roof. Then, his light caught something. Embedded in the concrete floor, half obscured by a thick layer of grime and detritus, was a symbol. It wasn't a corporate logo, nor was it a mundane marking. It was a crude, angular etching, a series of interlocking lines forming a distorted, almost predatory spiral, like a knot of grasping roots. Around it, faint, almost illegible, were carved words in an archaic script he didn't recognize. As more of the script became visible, a single, recurring word began to stand out, etched again and again, deeper than the rest, as if carved with desperate intent. He pulled out his phone, snapped a picture, and frantically typed the symbols into a translation app. The result flickered on the screen. Stark and terrifying, claim. Reid stared at the word, then back at the symbol, the spiral seeming to writhe in the dim light. Claim. The land. The ancient significance. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. The phenomena weren't random, they were heralds. And he, Reid, was being drawn into its terrifying embrace. Reid's hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool beneath his palms. The sun, a bruised orange, was sinking fast, casting long, distorted shadows across the forgotten road. He hadn't bothered to call the caretaker back, hadn't paused to deliberate. The words, hallowed, ancient significance, had burrowed into his skull, leaving a cold, insistent ache. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old rust mixed with faint decay. Finally, a break in the dense foliage revealed it, a hulking, skeletal silhouette against the fading light. The derelict factory. It squatted low, a monstrous, forgotten thing of corroded corrugated iron and broken windows, its roofline sagging like a weary spine. It looked less like a place of industry and more like a mausoleum for forgotten ambition. He parked his truck a distance away, the gravel crunching loudly under the tires, a harsh punctuation mark in the quiet. The metallic tang in the air was stronger here, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of neglect. He could hear the faint, distant calls of nightbirds, but closer, there was only the mournful sigh of the wind sifting through the broken panes of the factory. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from his toolbox, its beam a stark, artificial spear against the encroaching gloom. The main gate hung askew, a twisted parody of an entrance, its rusted hinges groaning a protest as he pushed it open. Inside, the ground was a treacherous landscape of broken concrete, rebar jutting like skeletal fingers, and the persistent, invasive greenery that had begun reclaiming the space. He moved carefully, his boots kicking up dust and loose debris. Each step echoed, amplified by the vast, empty space, making him feel terribly small and exposed. He moved through the cavernous main floor, past silent, rusted machinery that stood like petrified beasts. He found himself drawn towards a section of the factory that seemed older, less touched by the grand industrial machinery. A smaller, two-story building attached to the main structure, possibly an administration office or a storage annex. Pushing through a splintered door that hung by a single hinge, he entered a corridor. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of mildew and aged paper. On either side, doors stood ajar, revealing empty offices, their desks long gone, only faint rectangular outlines on the grimy floors marking their former presence. He was searching for something specific, though he couldn't articulate what. Just evidence. Not immediately, but as his flashlight beam swept across the back wall. He ran his hand over it, feeling a faint seam where no seam should be. His pulse quickened. He braced his shoulder against the paneling and pushed. It didn't budge. He tried again, putting more force into it, a grunt escaping his lips. A faint creak, then a stubborn give. A hidden room. The beam of his flashlight revealed a small, dusty chamber, perhaps an old vault or a secure office. This was it. He could feel it. The cabinet was locked, a heavy padlock securing its double doors. He didn't have time for finesse. He found a loose length of rebar on the floor and, using it as a pry bar, forced the lock. He ignored the sudden thudding of his own heart. The doors swung open with a groan of tortured metal. Inside, tucked away beneath a stack of yellowed ledgers, was a bound leather journal. He pulled it out, blowing off a layer of fine dust. The faint, sweet smell of old paper and something else, something herbal and faintly acrid, drifted up to him. He flipped it open, the pages brittle. The handwriting was precise, elegant, but the ink had faded to a sepia tone. The entries dated back nearly a century. The land demands its due. Our forebears understood this, though they sought to master what cannot be mastered. A sacrifice, to appease the hungry earth and its ancient dweller. Not a full cessation, but a channeling. Pact. Sacrifice. Binding. Ancient dweller. He flipped more pages, his fingers trembling slightly. The firstborn of each generation, offered not to death, but to service. To contain the creeping tendrils, to feed the soil with their essence, lest the forest claim us all. My grandfather, then my father, now Reid. This factory, built not for industry, but as a ward. A cage, to hold the essence, to channel the raw power of the hungry earth away from the family, away from the wider world. But the binding weakens. The entity grows restless. The bloodline thins. We are running out of time. The words blurred before his eyes, but their meaning solidified into a horrifying truth. His family. The cabin. The land. It was all connected. A lineage of sacrifice, not just for protection, but for containment. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was of the land, and his ancestors had made a pact, centuries ago, to appease it, to bind it, to feed it. And the factory, this hulking, derelict shell, was not just a relic of industry, but a part of that binding, a massive, forgotten ward. He thought of the sudden, mysterious death of his distant relative, the one who owned the cabin before him. The bloodline thins. We are running out of time. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. He wasn't just inheriting a cabin, he was inheriting a burden, a curse. And the entity, whatever it was now turning its attention to him. He was the next link in a chain forged in blood and desperation, meant to hold back something ancient and malevolent that demanded its due. And it was hungry. The words from the journal still burned behind Reid's eyes, a searing brand on his understanding of reality. A lineage of sacrifice. Containment. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was of the land, a primal force his ancestors had fought to bind, and in doing so, had become bound themselves. He stood amidst the scattered pages, the ancient paper smelling of dust and something metallic, a scent that clung to his fingers. The air in the cabin had thickened, becoming an almost physical presence, pressing in from all sides. It felt less like a building and more like a gullet, slowly swallowing him whole. He reached for his phone, a desperate, irrational lunge for connection. His fingers fumbled, slick with a sudden, cold sweat. The screen remained stubbornly dark. He pressed the power button again, then again, a frantic rhythm against the silent device. Nothing. The battery had been full just hours ago. He tossed it onto the rough-hewn table, the small clatter sounding unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. A low creak sounded from the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if a great weight had shifted. Reid spun, his breath catching in his throat. The door to the cellar, which he had securely latched, now stood ajar, a sliver of inky blackness visible beyond the threshold. He hadn't even touched it since the first day. His mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel. He needed to get out. As his hand closed around the iron knob, a faint, almost imperceptible sound drifted from outside. A low, rhythmic clang, like metal striking metal, echoing through the dense forest. It was too regular to be an animal, too distant to be the cabin itself. It sounded like work, or perhaps, a signal. It pulled at him, a strange magnetism, promising an answer, a reprieve from the cabin's suffocating grip. He hesitated, then pushed the door open, stepping out into the twilight. The clanging persisted, a phantom bell in the distance, drawing him deeper into the woods, not towards the path he'd come in on, but in a new direction. The forest grew denser, the trees thicker and more gnarled, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers. The clang grew louder, more distinct, leading him through a thicket of thorns that tore at his jacket and trousers. He pushed through, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the trees began to thin, giving way to a clearing. Before him loomed a monstrous silhouette against the bruised sky, a derelict factory. Its skeletal frame, a rusted lattice of girders and corrugated iron, stretched upwards, an industrial ruin swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes, and a vast, gaping maw where a loading bay once stood invited him into its decaying heart. Reid approached cautiously, the ground beneath his feet shifting from soft earth to cracked asphalt, littered with shards of glass and corroded metal. The air here was heavy with the smell of mildew, rust, and a faint, acrid chemical odor that stung his nostrils. He stepped inside the main hall. The vast space was a cathedral of decay, light filtering in weakly through dust-caked skylights, illuminating dancing motes in the stagnant air. But the words had been clear, distinct, a voice that was not his own, yet seemed to know his deepest fears. He started walking deeper, his boots echoing. He stumbled, his mind reeling, his grip on reality fraying. He saw flashes, not of the factory, but of the cabin, then of an older, unfamiliar structure, then faces, distorted and screaming, their mouths open in silent agony. His ancestors. The sacrifices. Were these their ghosts, or the entity's twisted mockery? He pushed through a sagging doorway, entering what looked like a collapsed administrative office. Dust covered everything, a thick, gray blanket. A lone, rusted filing cabinet stood askew, its drawers half open, spilling yellowed papers onto the floor. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he knelt, his hands trembling as he sifted through the brittle documents. Most were illegible, faded into oblivion. But then, his fingers brushed against something solid, embedded in the back wall behind the cabinet. He pulled it free. With shaking hands, he scraped away the corrosion, revealing a symbol etched into the surface, a spiral within a jagged circle, identical to the one he'd seen in the cabin's journal. Below it, faded but still legible, were archaic letters, not English. Clearly a date, even older than the cabin's construction. Spectacularly. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was everywhere on this cursed land, and this factory was a testament to its ancient, unyielding power. A guttural growl echoed from the main hall, impossibly deep, vibrating through the concrete floor and up into his bones. He tried to run back the way he came, towards the gaping maw of the loading bay, towards the faint hope of the outside world. But the exit was gone. In its place stood a solid wall of rusted metal, impenetrable and absolute. He spun around, frantic, his eyes darting through the decaying structure. He was trapped. Not just in the cabin, not just in the factory, but on the land itself. The entity had made its move, and the forest, the cabin, and now this derelict factory, had become a living, breathing trap, closing around him. Facade. A heavily camouflaged entrance. He peered into the darkness, a cold, stale draft carrying that metallic scent, now stronger, up from the depths. He grabbed the oil lamp and stepped into the passage, his heart thundering. The passage sloped downwards, the air growing colder, heavier. The walls were rough-hewn stone, expertly fitted, not natural rock. This was built deliberately. He followed the passage for what felt like an eternity, the drip, drip, drip growing louder, more insistent, a morbid pulse. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber, roughly circular, carved out of the earth. Around it, smaller alcoves were carved into the walls, each containing a wooden box. He opened the nearest box. Inside, another journal, older, its leather cover crumbling, and another, and another. Dozens of them, stretching back generations, each belonging to a Vance. He recognized the symbols from Elias's journal etched into the stone altar. He picked up one of the oldest journals, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was elegant, almost scholarly, from a man named Thomas Vance, dated 1888. The pact was sealed by our ancestor, Elara Vance, generations ago, Thomas had written. The land was cursed, the entity, the weeper, ravenous. It threatened to consume all, but Elara, in her desperation, offered a bargain. Not blood, not flesh, but the identity of one of her line, every cycle. A conduit, a vessel, to contain the entity, to keep it from spreading beyond these grounds. The cabin, this bunker, was built to facilitate this. To hold the weeper, and to hold its chosen host. Reid stumbled back, gasping. A bunker, he whispered, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. The thick walls, the lack of windows, the oppressive quiet, the complete isolation, it all made horrifying sense. This wasn't a cabin in the woods, it was a prison, a containment facility, designed to trap something ancient and malevolent. And Elias had been the last host. His sudden, mysterious death wasn't a passing, it was a transfer. He flipped through another journal, this one from Elara Vance, dated 1947. The weeper does not kill, not truly. It devours the self. It twists the mind, warps memories, until the host becomes an echo, a part of its endless hunger. We are bound to it. We are the stewards, the keepers of the curse. And when our time comes, we yield. For the sake of the world above. Reid's hands trembled, dropping the journal. He was the next in line. He was the next sacrifice. The entity wasn't just tied to the land, it was tied to him, through his blood, through this twisted lineage. Elias's death wasn't just a signal, it was an invitation. The air in the bunker grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. They were clear, insidious, echoing not from the walls, but from within his own mind. "Welcome, Reid. You have come home." His own memories began to fray at the edges. He saw his face reflected in the polished surface of Reid scrambled to his feet, the metal plate clattering to the floor. But the exit was gone. He spun, his breath catching in his throat, a raw, desperate sound. The air in the derelict factory was thick with the scent of corrosion and something else, something cloying and ancient, like earth disturbed from a long sleep. He was trapped. Utterly, irrevocably trapped. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He pounded on the unforgiving steel, the dull thud echoing mockingly in the vast, empty space. No give. No seam. Just solid, unyielding iron. He pressed his ear against it, listening for any sign of the outside, but there was only the low groan of the structure itself, a sound like a giant settling into its grave. Then, a flicker. Not of light, but of perception. The rusted corrugated iron to his left seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. The dull gray paint on the wall across from him bled into a deeper, richer brown, the texture shifting, graining. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, convinced his mind was finally fracturing under the strain. But when he looked again, the change was more pronounced. The metallic scent began to wane, replaced by the unmistakable aroma of aged timber and damp earth, the scent of the cabin. A cold dread seeped into his bones. This wasn't escape. This was absorption. The concrete floor beneath his boots softened, the grit of metal filings giving way to the springy give of pine needles and compacted soil. Overhead, the skeletal remains of the factory roof, once a lattice of girders and broken skylights, now seemed to twist and contort, forming the familiar, low-slung ceiling of the cabin's main room. He stood amidst the impossible. The air, once stale, now held a faint, metallic tang mixed with the pervasive scent of pine and something else, something like wet ash and blood. His mind screamed for logic, but there was none to be found. This was the entity. This was its domain, its power to warp and twist the very fabric of existence. It hadn't trapped him in the factory, it had brought the factory into the cabin, or the cabin into the factory, melding them into a single, terrifying nightmare. He gripped the small, carved wooden totem he'd snatched from the cabin's mantelpiece before his desperate flight, the rough wood digging into his palm. A desperate, foolish hope, perhaps, but it was all he had. The old woman, the relative he barely knew, had left it behind, tucked beneath a loose floorboard. She'd always been a peculiar figure, a recluse, rumored to dabble in old ways. He'd dismissed it as superstition then. Now, with the walls of his reality crumbling, it felt like a lifeline. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floor, a sound that seemed to originate from the very core of the warped factory cabin. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and suffocating. They weren't solid, but rather a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat haze given malevolent sentience. The acrid smoke from the hearth press thickened, stinging his eyes. He could feel it now, the entity, not as a single point, but as an pervasive, malicious intelligence that filled every crevice of this impossible space. It pulsed with ancient hunger, a desire that transcended simple bloodlust, a craving for something deeper, something tied to lineage and sacrifice. He clutched the wooden totem tighter, his gaze sweeping the hybrid room. The old woman's journals, found scattered in the cabin, had spoken of a way, a severance, a breaking of the chains. It was all cryptic, hinting at a counter-ritual, a payment of a different kind. He saw faces within them, indistinct and fleeting, yet eerily familiar. His own face, distorted. The old woman's haunted eyes. Generations of faces, a silent, spectral gallery of those who had come before, those who had made the pact, and those who had paid its price. The entity wasn't just a monster, it was the collective memory, the collective sin of his family, given terrifying form. To break it, one must give back what was taken, not what was given. He looked down at the floor, now a blend of dirt, pine needles, and rusted metal plates. The entity wanted a sacrifice, yes, but not his life in the way he'd expected. It wanted him to understand, to participate in the breaking, not just be consumed. The truth, the revelation, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The pact wasn't just for power or protection, it was a binding to the land itself, a promise of perpetual nourishment for something ancient and hungry, rooted deep beneath the cabin. He knelt, heedless of the shifting ground, the wooden totem still clenched in one hand. He reached into his pocket with the other, his fingers closing around the small, smooth river stone he'd picked up from the creek near the cabin, a memento of a simpler time, before this nightmare began. He had carried it with him, a mundane comfort. Now, he understood its significance. It was from this land, untainted by the pact, pure and elemental. The entity's hum intensified, vibrating through his very bones, a sound of ancient fury and desperate anticipation. He held it out, a desperate offering, a defiance, a severance. "I break the pact," he declared, his voice trembling but firm, echoing unnaturally loud in the impossible space. "I return what was stolen. Not blood, but the earth itself, unburdened." As he spoke, the ground beneath him convulsed. The air shimmered violently. The cabin factory began to tear itself apart, not slowly, but with violent, wrenching force, the walls groaning, the beams cracking like thunder. The pact was old, deeply rooted, and its severance was tearing the very fabric of this twisted reality apart. Reid stumbled back, clutching the soil and stone, the air thick with dust and the entity's wounded, furious roar. He had made his stand, but the battle was far from over. The factory cabin was collapsing, and he was still inside. Doubt his very existence. It wasn't just after a sacrifice, it wanted to become him, to absorb his identity into the endless chorus of Vance's, perpetuating its own horrific existence. Desperate, Reid stumbled, trying to find a way out. He slammed his fist against the bunker walls, futilely searching for another hidden mechanism, another passage. He tried to destroy the journals, tearing at their brittle pages, but they resisted, like ancient hide, and the symbols on the altar glowed with a faint, malevolent light, mocking his efforts. The bunker itself seemed to shift around him, the corridors twisting, doors appearing where there were none, then vanishing. He scrambled back to the passage leading to the surface, but it had changed. It was longer, narrower, the air thick with a cloying sweetness that made his head spin. He could hear faint sounds from above ground now, not the wind, not the rustling leaves, but faint, mournful wails, like the cries of lost souls. His phone. He fumbled for it, needing to reach someone, anyone star. He found a brief, miraculous flicker of signal. He dialed the detective who had handled Elias's case, his fingers clumsy, his breath ragged. "Hello," he gasped into the phone, his voice barely a whisper. "Detective? It's Reid Vance." Elias Vance. The cabin. It's not what it seems. There's something here. Something ancient. It's trying to take me. There was a pause, a crackle of static. Then, the detective's voice, calm, almost dismissive. Mr. Vance? You sound distressed. Are you all right? There's nothing unusual about that property. Elias Vance passed away from natural causes. Just an old man, alone in the woods. You should get some rest. The voice was too calm, too detached, almost echoing the entity's own placid cruelty. It sounded distorted, as if coming from a great distance, or through a thick, suffocating veil. No! Reid cried, you don't understand. It's a bunker. It's a prison. They're all here. The Vances. They're trapped. The line went dead. The signal vanished. He was truly alone. He tried to run, to push through the twisting passages, but the bunker was a living maze. Walls bled a black, oily ichor that smelled of decay. Spectral figures, pale and translucent, flickered in the periphery, their features indistinct, but their eyes were filled with the same ancient weariness he'd seen in Elias's reflection. They beckoned him deeper, their silent pleas echoing the whispers in his mind. Join us. Become us. Reid stumbled into the central chamber again, exhausted, his sanity fraying like old rope. He looked at his reflection in the altar, and this time, there was no single face staring back. It was a shifting mosaic of faces, Elias, Thomas, Clara, countless others, their features merging, dissolving, reforming. And in the center, struggling to emerge, was his own face, distorted, eyes wide with terror, slowly being subsumed by the collective. I am Reid. We're stronger now, a chorus of ancient voices. You are ours. You are us. You are the weeper. He closed his eyes, the metallic tang of the air filling his lungs, the low hum resonating through his bones, no longer a vibration.